In this video, I will tell you the story of the Swiss campaign, the final and most dramatic act of the Russo-Austrian army under the command of Field Marshal Alexander Suvorov in September, early October 1799. Let's go back a bit. What brought the Russian army to these distant mountainous lands? As you may know, in 1792, a war broke out. A war launched by a coalition of European powers against revolutionary France. This war ended in 1797 with the Treaty of Campo Formio, a French victory thanks to the brilliant campaign of General Bonaparte in Italy. But peace did not last. In 1798, a new alliance rose from the ashes, the Second Coalition. This time it included Great Britain, the Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Kingdom of Naples, and several German principalities. But Napoleon? He was far away, busy conquering Egypt, and so the French army in Europe was led not by a military genius, but by talented generals nonetheless. One of the key theaters of war was northern Italy, the Cisalpine Republic, and Piedmont. At Austria's request, the Allied forces chose as their commander-in-chief the legendary Russian field marshal, the man said to be invincible, Alexander Suvorov. In March 1799, Suvorov arrived in Vienna. As Russian troops poured in, he began preparing for active operations. The Allies had a major advantage. Against the 86,000 Austrians under General Melas and the 65,000 Russians, the French had just 58,000 troops, commanded by General Scherer. But after losing to the Austrians at the Battle of Magnano in April, Scherer was forced to resign. He was replaced by a far more capable man, the famed Jean-Victor Moreau. I won't dwell long on Suvorov's Italian campaign. Let me just say it lasted from April to the end of August 1799, and it was, by all accounts, a victory. The Russo-Austrian forces defeated the French in several battles. Three stand out: the Battle of the Adda in April, the Battle of the Trebia in June, and finally, the Battle of Novae in August 1799. The situation of the Allies in northern Italy had improved so significantly that it was decided the Austrians could now achieve the war's objectives on their own, under the command of General Michael von Melas. As for the Russian army, under Suvorov, it was to be redeployed to another theater of war, one that seemed at the time far more important. So, where was Suvorov's army to go? In August 1799, an Anglo-Russian landing was planned in the so-called Batavian Republic, today the Netherlands. The goal was to overthrow the pro-French regime and restore the rule of Stadtholder William of Orange. To support the landing, all Austrian troops stationed in Switzerland, 58,000 men under Archduke Charles, were ordered to march north and join the Anglo-Russian Corps in Holland. In exchange to hold Switzerland, Russian troops from Italy were to be sent in. On August 17, Emperor Francis II ordered Suvorov to begin the crossing of the Alps. 12 days later, on August 29, Archduke Charles began redeploying his army toward the Dutch border. The landing itself, it had already begun on August 27. Now, what troops were left in Switzerland? Facing the Allies was the army of General André Massena, numbering around 77,000 men. But not all of them could be used in battle. Many units were scattered, some on the Upper Rhine, some garrisoning towns along the German border, others securing internal communications. Massena had 48,000 to 50,000 soldiers in 6 divisions directly available for combat. Among his subordinates were Generals Mortier and Soult, both, like Massena himself, future marshals of France. His artillery included about 120 guns. On the Allied side, the main force in Switzerland was the corps of General Alexander Rimsky-Korsakov, 26,000 men with 56 guns. There was also an Austrian corps under Frederick von Holtze, left behind by Archduke Charles, about 25,000 troops. Additional Austrian detachments under Lincoln and Jelisich numbered 5,000 to 7,000 men each. But it is important to note only Rimsky-Korsakov's corps stood in direct proximity to Massena's army. The Austrian forces were deployed closer to the border and could not immediately intervene. I think you'll agree one doesn't need to possess Napoleon's genius to understand the objective of Massena's army. It was absolutely necessary to defeat Rimsky-Korsakov's corps before Suvorov's forces could arrive. As for Suvorov, his goal is just as clear. He had to reach the Austro-Russian forces in Switzerland as quickly as possible, and for that, speed was everything. But the campaign didn't begin on time. At that moment, Austro-Russian forces were still besieging the fortress of Tortona. The French garrison showed no intention of surrendering, and yet capturing the fortress was vital. If it remained in enemy hands, there could be serious complications. On August 22nd, the commandant of Tortona proposed a 20-day truce. If no French relief arrived by the end of that term, he would surrender under honorable conditions. Suvorov weighed the risks. Breaching Tortona's thick, casemated defenses could take weeks and cost many lives. To avoid unnecessary losses, he accepted the truce. But time was not on his side. Just 3 days before the truce expired, on September 8, the Russian army began moving toward the mountain passes, leaving Tortona to the Austrians. But that same day, French columns were spotted approaching to relieve the fortress. Though the front in Italy was now held by the Austrians, Suvorov was forced to turn back. Upon seeing the returning Russians, General Moreau withdrew into the mountains. Tortona did surrender on schedule, but Suvorov's army lost several precious days. And in my view, this delay sealed the fate of the campaign. Massena was an energetic and very talented commander, and he seized the moment. First, and most critically, he crushed Rimsky-Korsakov's corps. I'll return to that in more detail later. Second, he brought French detachments up to the key points along Suvorov's projected route. That move made the crossing far more difficult. Now, let's look at Suvorov's forces. His army numbered about 21,000 men. At the front, an advance guard of 4,000 to 5,000 under General Bagration. At the rear, a corps under Fyodor Rosenberg, 5,000 to 6,000 strong. The rest under Suvorov's direct command. The core of the army was infantry. Only Cossack units were retained from the cavalry. Most of the artillery had been sent by a roundabout route through Austria. Only 36 light guns, 3 and 6 pounders, remained. Alongside Suvorov operated a brigade under Austrian General Offenberg, estimated at 2,500 to 5,000 men depending on the source. There were 2 possible routes for the campaign. The first, to head northeast toward the upper Rhine and join up with the Austrian corps of Jelisich and Hotz. The second, to cross the St. Gothard Pass, descend into the Reuss River Valley, and join Rimsky-Korsakov directly. The first route was longer, about 180 kilometers, but easier in terms of terrain. The second route, just 150 kilometers, but it meant crossing one of the most difficult mountain passes in Europe. Suvorov chose the harder path, through St. Gothard. The decision remains debated to this day, but Suvorov had very strong reasons for it. He feared that while he circled the Alps to reach Hotz, Massena, unopposed, would destroy Rimsky-Korsakov, whereas, by breaking through St. Gothard, Suvorov could strike directly at Massena's flank and reach Rimsky-Korsakov by the shortest possible route. So, on September 11, 1799, Tortona fell, and the Russo-Austrian army began its march toward Switzerland. By September 15th, they were already in Taverne, and on the morning of September 24th, they stood before the crossing of the St. Gothard Pass. They had left behind the fertile plains of Piedmont and Lombardy. Now soldiers were staring up at towering cliffs, always covered in ice and snow. That's what they had to climb now, with weapons in hand. The soldiers froze. They grumbled, stopped, refused to go on. And then Suvorov acted, in his own legendary style. He ordered a pit to be dug in the road, and lay down in it. He said, "Bury me here. Leave your general behind. You are no longer my children, and I am no longer your father. All that remains for me is to die." Silence. And then a roar. The soldiers rushed to him. They wept. They begged, "Let us go. Let us take St. Gothard." Thus, on September 24th, the battle for control of the St. Gothard Pass began. There, they were already awaited by the French from Le Courbe's division. The French numbered only 9,000, but the advantages of their position and knowledge of the terrain gave them a tremendous edge. The French infantry were equipped with special shoes fitted with iron spikes, while the soldiers of the Allied army slipped on the icy cliffs and constantly fell into the abyss. 2 assaults were thrown back, heavy losses, and by 4 p.m. the mountains were already growing dark. Spending the night here meant defeat. Suvorov gave the order, one more assault. And at that moment a miracle. Bagration's detachment appeared in the French rear after scaling vertical cliffs around their flank. The St. Gothard Pass was taken. But the road ahead? Blocked again. Near the village of Ursurin, an enormous vertical cliff wall. Only one way through. The Ursurin Hole. A narrow passage just 80 paces long, so tight that 2 men with packs couldn't pass each other. On the other side, a sharp curve, and then nothing. A sheer drop down to the Reuss River. But high above the torrent, trembling in the spray, stood a narrow arch of stone, the Devil's Bridge. I won't tell you every twist of that furious battle. It would take hours. Let me just say this. The Devil's Bridge was taken, and by September 26, Suvorov's army entered Altdorf. Next stop, the village of Schwyz, near Zurich, where Rimsky-Korsakov was stationed. But there, Suvorov was met with bitter surprise. Only 2 roads from Altdorf, and both led east. Schwyz could only be reached by Lake Lucerne, controlled by the French fleet. No land route. Unless you counted 2 narrow trails over the snow-covered Rostock Ridge, descending into the Mutadl Valley, and then to Schwyz. Even the Swiss considered them impassable in autumn. But Suvorov, he chose the Rostock. At the cost of unimaginable effort, Suvorov's army broke through into the Muotatal Valley, and on September 28th, it occupied the town of Muotatal, from which there was a road to Schwyz. In the Muotatal Valley, the conditions changed dramatically. The mountains seemed to part. The narrow basin gave way to a wide valley. Meadows and fields appeared, the snow-covered peaks hidden behind forests. But then, in Muotatal, Suvorov received news that shattered all plans. In a 2-day battle on September 25th and 26th, Massena had defeated Rimsky-Korsakov's corps. 9,000 men were lost. The corps was in complete disarray and began to retreat northward toward the borders of Switzerland. Worse still, on that same day on the Linth River, General Soult defeated Hotz's corps. The commander himself was killed at the very start of the battle, during reconnaissance. Upon learning of the defeat of the Russo-Austrian corps near Zurich, Suvorov understood. Continuing the advance toward Zurich, now occupied by the enemy's main forces, was pointless. Cossack patrols sent along the road to Schwyz discovered French troops there. After Hotz's defeat, the Austrians had retreated, and the French had sealed off the exit from the valley. The army was trapped, in a stone sack, surrounded by superior enemy forces, without food, with only a limited supply of ammunition. Suvorov's further stay in Switzerland had lost all meaning. They had to get out. But this was no easy task. It was an almost impossible one. The army was surrounded by mountains, often impassable. It was decided to break through the Pragal Pass to Glarus, to unite with Lincoln's corps. And on October 1st, Suvorov's army fought its way through to Glarus. But Lincoln was no longer there. Under French pressure, he had retreated. It was decided to break through further, leaving behind the severely wounded and sick in Glarus. To the mercy of the French, Suvorov's army began the final leg across the Panics Pass, 2,407 meters high. This was the last and the most difficult mountain crossing. The soldiers trudged, single file, along a winding path through deep snow, knee-deep, wrapped in thick fog, in the middle of a snowfall, buffeted by icy winds that knocked them off their feet. Many threw away their knapsacks, and even their rifles. The number of those who perished during this crossing reached 200. Sick or wounded, weakened by hunger, relentless marches, and grueling battles, they could not stay upright on the ice-covered trail. Some fell into ravines. Others simply fell asleep in the frost and never woke up. After crossing the pass on October 8th, the army reached the town of Chur in the Rhine Valley. In total, about 14,000 soldiers and officers emerged from the campaign. Of those, only 10,000 were still able to hold a weapon. The rest, sick, snowblind. The losses? About 6,000 men, all artillery pieces, lost. In Chur, for the first time since Glarus, the soldiers received bread, meat, and a ration of vodka. Suvorov's Swiss campaign was over. In essence, this campaign marked the end of Russia's military operations in the Second Coalition. Soon after, Russia withdrew from the war. Suvorov, exhausted by illness and the strain of it all, never recovered. He died in the spring of 1800. I will not evaluate the results of the Swiss campaign myself. Instead, I'll cite the words of the great military theorist Karl von Clausewitz. In Switzerland, Suvorov accomplished the impossible, but without strategic benefit. It was a feat of desperation, not of reason. Goodbye.